Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 358 of the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solution, your one-stop shop for all compliance-related services. If you're interested in sponsoring one of my 8 podcasts or my blog, please feel free to give me a call. I have a very interesting media kit that I can provide to you. Today, I am interviewed by Jonathan Armstrong, a partner at Cordery Compliance. We take up a couple of different questions. The first one is, how do disruptive companies such as Uber approach compliance? When should they consider implementing a compliance regime, and how important are internal controls to startups? In our second question, Jonathan poses to me, what's the state of compliance in 2017 in both the United Kingdom, Europe, and in the United States? It's a fascinating exploration. Jonathan is an excellent interviewer, and we have a lively dialogue that he provided when I was in his offices recently of Cordery Compliance in London. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist. I'd like to thank you for listening to This Week in FCPA. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
I'm Jonathan Armstrong from Cordery, the Specialist Compliance Lawyers. I'm pleased to say that Tom Fox is with us today. He's come all the way from Houston to chat. One of the things, Tom, that we've been talking about quite a lot, and I think we've both got an interest in, is the way in which disruptive companies approach compliance. Now, Uber might be the poster child for how not to do it right. What lessons can we learn from Uber and scandals like that?
So actually, I put that question to a chairman of an audit committee of a U.S. public company on the board of directors. And his response was, I think along the lines of most professionals' responses, is that disruptive companies, startup companies, new companies, companies getting their first and second rounds of funding, need to put in the infrastructure for good corporate governance as soon as possible. Because if you do succeed and you experience literally explosive growth as Uber did, and you get to a valuation of $70 billion, what worked for you as a $1 or $2 billion company will not work when you're a worldwide $70 billion valued company. You've got to have the structure in place that can expand out and grow as your business grows. It's not rocket science. It's basic financial controls that every U.S. public company has. There are plenty of people who can tell you what they are, but it's internal financial controls, and it's good corporate governance. It's oversight and looking at issues, managing strategic risk, having a plan to manage that risk. But if you don't have that in place and you wait until you're literally the next big thing, you position yourself to be extremely negatively impacted, either both legally or reputationally. And I think Uber, you're right, is the poster child for that. They grew so fast, but they consciously never put the financial controls in place. And the basic example I would point to is Travis Kalanick's downfall started with a blog post from a former Uber employee who detailed her experiences around not only sexual harassment, but reporting that harassment and literally being told that person is a high producer for this company and they can't be touched. Well, that's a basic failure of an HR control. HR should always investigate, and they should always follow the law. The law in the United States says you cannot sexually harass. And here they were not only allowing this to happen, but they allowed it to continue going forward. So even those basic controls that you might not think are financial controls should have been placed in Uber. But by allowing that culture to fester and foster, they allowed the start of the downfall of the company, or at least the downfall of the former CEO. Where the company goes, it's still open to be seen, or an open question. But having those structures of good corporate governance in place is important so that when you do become the next Uber, you won't suffer those same problems. So I advocate putting them in as soon as possible. Many companies do not have that in-house expertise, but certainly we both know people that can do that. We both do that sort of thing, not to toot our own horns, but That's what outside experts do for smaller companies. Many of the companies I work for are $50 to $100 million, and they're too small to have a chief compliance officer, but they recognize the need for a robust compliance program. I would expect it would be the same with your type of GDPR compliance, that they may not have that in-house expertise. So bringing in an outside expert to set the framework up and guiding a client through that is absolutely essential for a company who wants to go to literally the stratosphere of economic valuation, such as Uber has.
Yeah, I had an interesting experience, I guess, a long time ago now, maybe 2003, 2004, maybe in the first dot-com boom. We had a client, a well-known Fortune 100 business, who was investing a lot in dot-com businesses. And they asked me and two other lawyers to sit on a panel where, almost like you have Shark Tank, we have Dragon's Den, a little bit like that. The organization, the potential investees for the corporation would come and present, and basically they'd have to go through a business case, and then finally they'd have to do this conference call with three lawyers. And we said, so what's our role in that? And the guy who led the project said, our issue is that these people are just over-surrounded with positivity. And his view was, who can I find that are the most negative beings on the planet? A panel of three lawyers. But I think we did do a good job in that case, not just necessarily to be wholly negative, but sometimes to ask challenging questions about business model or compliance or whatever. And the issue that they described was a little bit like, I don't know whether you have it, we have it's an ESOP fair thing called the Emperor's New Clothes, yes, where people don't go, in those days particularly, and I think I still see it with conventional investors, they don't go, I'm neutral on that idea. They see an idea, they don't understand the technology, they don't understand the business model, but they can't be seen to be the guy who doesn't get it. So what you see in organizations is people who are otherwise very sensible will say, absolutely stunning idea. If they were neutral, that'd be okay, because then people would assess whether the idea is good or not. But what we found in this project, and I've seen it in other areas, is nobody will stand up when somebody senior has said it's a great idea. Nobody will say, hang on, let's pause for a minute. So what I'm getting to is, I think some tech businesses, some disruptive businesses have done really well of engaging people that are older than the founders, that are maybe, there's a 20-year gap. That takes a lot of chutzpah, doesn't it, from somebody who's got their own baby and they're trusting old world people, in their view, to handle it. But is that part of the mix to good compliance?
So actually you bring up a very good point, because what I try to emphasize to the startup, to the disruptor, to the new business is, if you want investment, if you want either private equity money, if you want a bank loan, if you want any kind of income or capital to help you move to the next step, you're going to have a compliance program. Need to have a compliance program. So it's actually a business differentiator and something that will make you more attractive to investors. So when you explain that to a founder of a disruptor or a startup or a new company, and they understand that it's going to be significantly important for them to have a compliance program in place, or at least the infrastructure that they can begin to grow with as the company grows, and that they're thinking about it, that can be enough, I think, to sway a potential investor.
So it goes to value as well as doing the right thing.
Yes.
Well, that's been fascinating, Tom. Thanks very much for your thoughts on this. And Tom, it's probably been one of the most climactic years in compliance. Lots of moving parts with the new US administration, Brexit, the recent leaks into private data, all sorts of moving parts at once. Where's compliance headed? So, Jonathan, I think many people were concerned in November of last year about where compliance may be headed under the Trump administration. And one thing that we have seen consistently from the Sessions administration of the Department of Justice is that compliance will continue, because the Department of Justice views it as important to prosecute people who violate the law. As a regulator explained to me, she said, Tom, if someone's appointed
politically appointed to the head of a regulatory agency. They're not there not to prosecute cases. They are there to prosecute wrongdoers. And Jeff Sessions, whatever you may think of his political beliefs or his social positions, he is a strong law and order prosecutor. He was a prosecutor in the Department of Justice, senator, and now he's the head of the Justice Department. He's a law and order guy. He has specifically, on the record in public, talked about the importance of FCPA enforcement, talked about compliance as a response to or a way to prevent corruption violations. A couple of his underlings, Trevor McFadden, has spoken specifically about the need for compliance practitioners, and the compliance profession to help prevent violations. And Rod Rosenstein has spoken multiple times about the desire of this Department of Justice to prosecute individuals who violate the law. And it really makes sense. Prosecutors are not there to let scofflaws off for free. And the recent remarks by Rod Rosenstein that they're going to evaluate various department memos in light of the U.S. Attorney's Manual, that's really just a clarification, which is not unusual for any new administration. So the theme, at least in compliance, has certainly been continuity. There may be clarifications. For instance, in the United States, we have the FCPA pilot program that has been extended temporarily. That may become permanent. We may have yet another memo which once again says the Department of Justice will prosecute individuals. That was said specifically in the Yates memo of September 2015. And the number of compliance matters has dropped in 2017, but you have to remember 2016 was the largest year of FCPA fines and penalties and cases ever. So, but even this year, we had Rolls-Royce in January, and last month, or excuse me, in September, we had the Telia companies, which is the largest FCPA fine ever. So we've had declinations. We've had declinations with disgorgement. We've had SEC prosecutions. Halliburton agreed to an SEC sanction in late July. And then, as I mentioned, we had the Telia company, FCPA enforcement action. So once again, the theme of this year, I believe, has been continuity. But the other thing way to think about it is the lawyers who work in the Department of Justice, I would say, are largely like the lawyers at the Ministry of Justice or the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom. They are a cadre of professionals. They are dedicated to government service. They've made that decision. That's what they want to do. And regime change, political change at the top, change at the top of the department, that doesn't matter to them. They're going to enforce the law, and that's what they want to do. And so we have that professional class at the Department of Justice. We have that professional class at Securities and Exchange Commission. We recently, this week, had a new head of the FCPA unit named at the Securities and Exchange Commission, but he'd been the acting head. Prior to that, he'd been in the FCPA unit since the unit was opened in 2010. So once again, continuity rather than change. So for those who thought compliance was at the end of days and anti-corruption enforcement was at the end of days, that's turned out not to be true. And I would anticipate we would see more fine-tuning by the Department of Justice as it determines the priorities it wants to take going forward.
And then I guess the other thing that you've hinted at in those remarks really is that compliance is a global game, isn't it? You know, if you look at the Rolls-Royce settlement, it's a joint settlement with the UK, the US and Brazil, and there's cooperation from 10 or so different jurisdictions to bring that case to where it ends up. If you look at Telia, then obviously that's a global investigation as well. If you look at the league tables, I guess the US is still way above. I think the UK is second, Canada's the last time I looked, in terms of anti-corruption prosecutions brought. But there are other jurisdictions, Brazil being one, for example, that are playing much more of a part than they used to in the fight against corruption. So is it, even if there was a marginal drop, and you've explained why in the US, there are at least some other countries that are stepping up to the plate and sharing that load as well, are there?
Absolutely. You bring up a great point, which is the internationalization of not just anti-corruption and anti-bribery investigations, but enforcement. Here in the United Kingdom, we had the Rolls-Royce case, largest fine ever by the Serious Fraud Office. Actually, the number one anti-corruption fine of all time comes out of Brazil with a JBF case at $3.4 billion, I believe. So we've seen, starting with 2006, the fruition of U.S. regulator steps to create a cadre of professional anti-corruption investigators and prosecutors literally across the world. So we have prosecutors in every country. They have personal relationships now. They share information because they see bribery and corruption as truly a global scourge, and they want to try to fight that with all the tools that are available to them. So it would not surprise me to see more corruption or anti-corruption and anti-bribery enforcement efforts domiciled in countries like the United Kingdom, like the Netherlands, like Brazil, where the U.S. is a part of that, but they may not even be the lead part anymore. So very prescient observation, and it leads to perhaps the last point we could tackle, which is if the FCPA went away tomorrow, every company doing business in any of the countries you named would still have to have a best practices compliance program, because you will get in trouble in one of those countries. So whether that's Brazil, whether that's Spain, France even now, certainly the United Kingdom, over the weekend, Saudi Arabia. China has prosecuted Western companies, as we know, in the past. So you have to have a compliance program literally for every country in the world now.
Fascinating thoughts, Tom. Compliance obviously is a global game. Thanks for watching, and Tom, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, thank you. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about the top weekly podcast in compliance. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you will join me again next week for another episode.